Discrimination is a little different from prejudice and stereotyping. Prejudice and stereotyping both occur inside your head. Unless you decide to tell someone about your prejudices or about the stereotypes that you have, no one ever knows. They're internal. Discrimination, though, is something that you actually do. It's an overt act. It's an action that you take. So, for instance, here's a good example of discrimination. This is a sign that was in the New York Times from Texas, and this is only a couple years old. This is not from the 1950 civil rights movement or something. It says, "We serve whites only, no Spanish or Mexicans." So obviously this is a restaurant owner who is discriminating based on the ethnic and racial background of potential customers, and they're deciding that they're not going to serve anyone who they don't deem to be white. So that's an example of discrimination. Perhaps even more insidious is what's called institutional discrimination, and that is when you have discrimination that's not being done just by an individual, but that's being done by an entire part of society. For instance, the educational system used to be discriminatory, with separate white and black schools and very much unequal schools. And some would argue that this is still in place. For instance, this is the graduating picture from Princeton University from only about 2 years ago. I pulled this straight off their website. And this is just an example that they put up of what their graduating class looks like. And if you look through there, you may see, I know it's very small on your computer, but if you look, you may see that there's not a lot of racial diversity. So some would argue that even though it's not legal anymore to discriminate based on race, that we still have it in fact. And that's what's known as institutional discrimination, when organizations or entire parts of society discriminate, not just individuals. Okay, so I wanted to actually talk about what the definition of a minority group is for a sociologist. And the first thing is it's not based on number at all. Women are a minority group, according to sociologists. So it has nothing to do with number. It's not based on that. What does set it apart is that minority groups are set apart for unequal treatment, and they're denied power by the majority group. So because of the group that you belong to, you're being set apart from the majority, and you're being treated in an unequal way. That's actually how it's defined in sociology. This really kind of calls into question, or not into question, but into mind, hopefully, that concept of in-group and out-group behavior that we talked about. In-groups are groups that you yourself belong to. Out-groups are groups that you don't belong to. And since at birth you're either male or female, and at birth you're some race, you have some sort of racial or ethnic identity, this really leads to natural in-group, out-group behavior because you already are a part of a group, even at birth, and there are other people who are different from you. And you can see that at a very early age, and you start to develop this sense that other groups are unlike you. And there's a natural tendency to therefore decide that those other groups are inferior since you're not part of them. That's what in-group, out-group behavior tends to do, is overvalue groups that you happen to be in. And so this leads to racism and sexism. Racism is simply the belief that one race is innately superior to another, that just being born white or being born black or being born whatever makes you superior to people of another race. White racism believes that white people are superior to all other races. Black racism would believe that black people are superior to all other races. If you're an Asian racist, you think that Asians are superior racially to all other groups. Racism is not just white. Sexism is not just male. Any belief that race or sex determines superiority in society is racist or sexist. And so that's what we mean when we're talking about minority groups. They're groups that are set aside for unequal treatment and that tend to lack power. Okay, and then I wanted to talk about, finally, some of the cultural patterns that we have for addressing minority groups. And what I mean by this is ways that the majority deals with minority groups and their culture. And the most severe way that majority groups deal with minority groups is through genocide. Genocide involves actually killing off all the members of minority groups. Obviously, that's the most serious thing that a group could do to another, is simply to kill all the other group's members. So genocide, as we see in places today like the Sudan, in Rwanda, in parts of Asia, in Serbia and Bosnia in Europe, where the genocide was just occurring, and of course, famously in World War II with Hitler's genocide of the Jews, attempted genocide of the Jews. That is really the most serious or most severe way that majority groups can treat minorities, is simply to kill all other members of that minority group. We also have, and then the second one down, the next most serious, is segregation. Segregation means separation. It's when you separate people based on race or sex or whatever, and you set them apart. And this sign, by the way, did not come from the United States. I'll give you a second to guess where it came from. This is a much more modern sign than when we had segregation legally in the United States. This came from South Africa, where there were separate bathrooms there for white and non-white males, as you can probably tell from the sign. Segregation doesn't mean that necessarily you're being treated unequally. You're just separate. Now, in reality, almost all cases, you are unequal as well, because majority groups tend to, because they have the power, keep the better stuff for themselves. And so many times with segregation, that's one of the big problems with it, is that if you keep people separate, they're not getting equality. They're not truly achieving the same things that the majority group is achieving, and they tend to not achieve more power, because when you keep groups separate, there's no real mixing, and that tends to make groups fear each other and hate each other, and that's not a good recipe for building a lasting society with shared power. So the next way of dealing with minority groups is what's called assimilation. This one we're getting a little more open, a little less restrictive. Assimilation simply means that majority groups melt into or become part of the majority. So with assimilation, the minority group kind of give up their old identity, whatever it may be, racial or ethnic or whatever, and they kind of merge with the majority culture. That's what's meant by assimilation. This is the old American melting pot theory, where people just melt into society. And so that's what's meant by assimilation. You all become one big majority culture, and you can't tell anymore that old minority group that you came from. And then finally, the least restrictive kind of group is what's called pluralism. In pluralism, this is different from assimilation in that minority groups don't give up their old culture. You can still tell all the cultural diversity. This is also referred to as multiculturalism, because everyone from these minority groups retains their old culture, as pictured here, but they also become part of the majority group, of the dominant culture. And so you have this pluralistic society, plural meaning more than one. You have more than one culture all living together as part of a big society. And so this is the way that America, at least, is moving at this point. We're becoming less of the American melting pot and more of a tall salad, where you can still see the individual parts that are in there, and they're not all blended together as they would be in a stew or the melting pot, but they're all part of one big dish, a salad, but you can still see the individual parts that make up that dish. So that's what meant by pluralism or multiculturalism. Okay, thanks.